Yeah, it's an interesting story, Julian. Ever since I got back, I came to the attention, firstly, of the Myanmar regime, who were incredibly unhappy that I was sort of blowing the whistle on them and the conditions in which I was held. But then, as I started to write more analytical pieces about the country's finances and role of Myanmar's banks, I suddenly got these letters from international law firms acting on behalf of some of Myanmar's crony banks, basically trying to shut me up. And this has happened again and again. And so I decided just the other day that, I've just got to go public on this. I can't go public, unfortunately, on the bank or the law firm involved, because in fact, that is part of the threat. But I thought the broader issue is one that needs to be drawn attention to, basically. And since doing that, I found out that there are other people who have likewise faced this practice. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. The terrible irony of it, that here's a regime and people connected to them who are anything but law abiding, who are sort of renegades from the international system, and yet they use Western law firms to try and shut people up who are critiquing them. So, yeah, the ironies abound, but yeah, but I just thought it was time to draw people's attention to it, even though I can't mention them individually by name, but at least I can just alert people that this sort of thing is going on. Yeah, it sure did. I don't know what they were thinking. Somehow Min Aung Hlaing seems to have had the idea that I wouldn't tell anyone about what happened to me. The most extraordinary thing. And when I was released, I signed nothing. I was under no legal compunction to be silent or anything like that. And so I had no desire to be silent either when I got home. So yeah, but anyway, he seems to have been particularly affronted by this and personally upset, I'm told, and revoked the pardon. So there it goes. I suppose the one practical thing for me is that, of course, I can't be in Myanmar anytime soon. Need to avoid the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And also, some other places in the world that might be aligned to them. So it has clipped my wings a little bit, but to be frank, probably the sort of countries for which it would be an issue are not particularly the ones I'd want to visit anyway. But there you have it. It is. It's a bit strange though, because the book actually doesn't really deal with the issues that might concern these people. But I think they get anxious whenever I write something. So as I say, these letters are quite common. I get them anytime that something is coming up. So my latest book is coming out in a month or two. And I think that sort of provoked them into action. But yeah, it's become a little bit routine, as I say, but at the same time, something that I really wanted to let people know about, because it's yet another avenue through which the regime is sort of extending, or trying to control people, even outside Myanmar. Well, essentially, it's the story of economic reform in Myanmar under the Aung San Suu Kyi or NLD government. I was really worried, Julian, to be honest, mate, since coming out, that the story of what that government was trying to do is a bit lost. I think the narrative is all about, as it rightly should be, about the coup and the terrible abuses happening now. But the story of that government, particularly on the economic front, is of deep and profound economic reforms. Some of those reforms, in fact, I think discomforted the military very greatly and the cronies connected to them. So it's a story that's not without relevance to the coup and all that has come after it. But yeah, I really feared that it was going to be lost. And I think I wanted to make sure that the story went on the record. Also, I wanted to pay tribute to my Myanmar friends who, were very much the very brave drivers of these reforms. It was brilliant stuff, quite frankly, and I really wanted to pay tribute to them, and I didn't want their contributions to be forgotten. Yeah, I think it is in a way, Julian, because I wrote Fiery Dragons when I was an academic and studying Myanmar in great detail and all that. But in some ways, this new book, which is called The Best Laid Plans, is really after I put my money where my mouth was. I was given an opportunity to try and apply some of the ideas that were around about how to reform Myanmar's economy. So this is really the story of how we tried to do that. It's not a story with a happy ending, of course, because the coup took place, but it's also very much a story of a great struggle. And so, for every victory we made on the reform journey, we had at least one defeat. So it was always a struggle, all the way through. And it's not in any way an objective story, I hasten to add. It's very much just the story of what we were trying to do. Half of it, as I mentioned, never came off anyway. So it's very, very subjective. But yeah, I just wanted to get on the record. Well, this is what we were trying to do. This is the motivation. This is who were driving it. This is the sort of resistance that it encountered. And these were some of the outcomes. Into the abyss, Julian. I'm really sad to say, and I think you've used exactly the right expression, that this is uncharted. That the current regime, the SAC regime, have abandoned, it seems to me, any pretense at sort of economic management for any purpose other than using the economy to extract resources, for their own survival. If you look at all the policies they announce these days, none of them have got to do with, trying to improve Myanmar's GDP or living standards or, agricultural output or anything like that. It's all about extracting resources to buy munitions and advanced weaponry. And that, of course, usually means trying to get foreign exchange. And so, you look at all the policies, their import restrictions, their restrictions on the earnings of exporters, there are restrictions on remittances, there are various exactions on the banking system, etc. But it all has that one end, which is how can they yield as much foreign exchange as possible from the economy, then in order to buy military equipment and munitions, as I mentioned, from places like China and Russia and so on. So, yeah, it's interesting. I think it's almost to the stage where I think we can say that Myanmar doesn't have an economic policy. The entire economy, as far as the regime concerned, is a war economy, and it's really just an arena to extract resources from. Oh, I think that's absolutely right, mate. Particularly the sort of bestial regime that we've got at the moment, that really is facing. I mean, you use that wonderful expression, the abyss. So they're facing into a different sort of abyss. And I think they're using the economy to try and avoid that. And that is really their only objective. So yeah, I think, once again, we're almost in a realm where to talk about economic policy and so on is almost irrelevant, because I think their vision is so incredibly narrow and just about their own survival that the usual metrics, the usual statistics, the usual analytics just don't have any relevance, as I say, in Myanmar today. Yeah, I think so, unfortunately, Julian. And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you didn't know about Myanmar, you'd look at this and think, oh, well, look, it's a developing country. It's a very poor country trying to struggle its way through and things are not going well and so on. But you would think that, nonetheless, it has a government that's trying with some sort of development focus, some sort of, idea of where they want the economy and the country to be, where that's just not the case. That this is a regime that doesn't have a development focus. That is not the purpose of the economy at the moment. Again, as I say, the focus is really just incredibly short term. And so those usual narratives the sort that we typically read in reports by the World Bank, the IMF, Asian Development Bank, and so on. They really don't have any relevance to a country like Myanmar at the moment, where, yeah, it really is just a story of regime and even individual leadership survival. Yeah, no. So, in fact, I love the country, Julian, and in fact, my love for Myanmar, I think, was enhanced by the time that I spent in the prison. Funnily enough, because and I guess for the same reason that we've been talking about, and that is that the country unfortunately is captured by a very narrow elite of the country's military. But for the average Burmese citizen, firstly, they are the number one and first victims, and then later people like me become victims as well. But I was protected. I survived simply because of the help of Myanmar people who, as I say, are the first and primary victims of that regime. And I guess my experience is of Burmese people being firstly incredibly courageous, and then secondly, but linked to that, incredibly generous. Because again and again and again, I encountered people in conditions far worse than me, who had no chance of escaping, whose families outside the prison were being persecuted. All of that, I didn't have to worry about any of that. And yet they extended incredible generosity to me again and again and again. So, yeah, so to me, the ledger, if you like, of Burmese people is just so overwhelmingly positive that, yeah, my appreciation of the people and the country, is still one of profound love, even though, and yeah, and I not even though, I just, am so saddened by the fact that a group of people who I think are the nicest in the world are being ruled over by the most terrible people in the world. There seems something cosmically out of order at that structure, but that's where it is, alas. Yeah, and a number of things, Julian. I think number one, they wanted to use me to get at others. I think as we know, they've always had this narrative, particularly about Suu Kyi, but I think the NLD more broadly, that somehow they're beholden to foreign interests and all of that, and that the military are the only patriots. And so I think what they wanted to try and do is paint a story that I was some sort of master spy pulling the strings of Aung San Suu Kyi and the ministers and all of that, and that they were just sort of dupes in my hands and so on. Which is, to anyone who knows me, knows Suu Kyi or knows the ministers, would know how utterly absurd that was. But I think that was the story, So I think they wanted to paint something along those lines and exploit xenophobia that they thought existed amongst the Burmese people, which I don't think it does, by the way. But nonetheless, I think that's their direction that they were going. So that's number one. The second, I think, mate, does relate to the economic reforms that we were trying to put in place. And those reforms were not only about making Myanmar a more prosperous place, but it actually was to try and lever the military and the cronies out of the economy. I mean, the reforms were liberal, but liberal not just in terms of getting better outcomes, but at structural transformation. How could we make Myanmar a more normal country where the focus of economic activity was things like living standards and I guess just general prosperity. And so they hated that. So many of the policies that were being put in place were about injecting new competition, creating new opportunities for people outside the old power structure, without outside the old military crony elite. So yeah, so I think they were upset about that, and therefore upset about me, sort of quite personally. I think and I've mentioned the banks again and again, and I think that they were some of the leading figures in this, because some of the reforms on that side of things were really starting to bite. So I think, yeah, there was a bit of a personal element as well. And then the final thing I think, mate, but not to be dismissed easily, I think I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was sort of the most prominent foreigner who was there, to be caught. So I think I was there for the taking, basically. So I think that determined who it was, perhaps, rather than that they were going to grab some prominent foreigner, which I think they probably always had in mind. It's an interesting one, Julian, because obviously was on my mind at the time, and I think, to be honest, I'm a little bit at fault. I dilly dallied around a little bit, um, mainly because, mate, it seems ridiculous for me to say this now, but part of it, I felt that I didn't just want to run out on my Burmese friends, even though. There was little that I could do for them, although there were some things we could do in those first few days after the coup. But yeah, I didn't want to just get out, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure I could have got out anyway, I hasten to add, because, of course, one of the things we forget now is that this is still COVID. There were no regular flights out. There were only those very limited flights, for people with special tickets and special reasons to move and all that. So it wouldn't have been easy. But as I say, I think I probably should have tried and forced the issue very early on, or even just got in the car and drove to the border, or something like that. But anyway, I didn't do that until a few days afterwards, when it became sort of obvious that someone like me was going to be really vulnerable, and it was time to get out. But yeah, by then it was too late. I think they made a huge mistake, Julian. I think that all the way through. The only thing is, mate, I thought that right at the beginning, and it gave me a little bit of false optimism, to be honest, because I thought this is such bad publicity for them. And particularly, remember, in those early days after the coup, the initial narrative that the regime wanted to spread was that they were still going to continue with economic reforms. Their initial thing was, oh, look, we've come in, we're going to clean up the mess and get sort of a degree of control, but we're going to continue moving the country forward economically and all that. So arresting someone like me, who was so known, on the economic side, just didn't make any sense. And it could only upset the West, if you like, and many other countries that were likely investors. So yeah, didn't make any sense at all. So, but it did, as I say, give me a little bit of false optimism at the start, because I remember thinking, even after the arrest, I thought, they're going to release me soon. This doesn't make any sense, even for them, And I was always reliant on them knowing their own interests and thinking, well, that they can't keep me too long, because it's in their interest to get the international community off their backs. So surely they'll release me. But of course, as the days, weeks, months, and ultimately years went by, yeah, that wasn't the case. Absolutely, mate. Yeah, I really thought that's what they do, Julian, is scare me, scare other international people into not interfering and all the rest of it, and then just deport me straight out of the country, and good riddance, sort of thing, was what I thought they would do. But yeah, but instead they kept me, which of course then just meant, for a country like Australia particularly, which doesn't have that much skin in the game in terms of individuals, it just meant that everything they did was a constant story in Australia. Whatever happened in Myanmar, the local press, who were wonderful here in Australia, would then just link it to my continued imprisonment. So yeah, so it just meant a continual stream of bad press. So yeah, it just didn't make any sense at all, but it didn't stop them. Yeah, no, absolutely, mate. And I agree with you completely. It's a broader context of them just misreading the situation, which, a line that I like that's out and about these days is that this is a failed coup. And I think it's absolutely right. It's a coup still in progress. which hasn't reached its endpoint, but the endpoint does seem to be failure rather than success. Yeah, a few things kept me going, Julian. I think firstly, the support from home, from my wife, my dad, my sister, family, things like that, and then support from everyone. Basically, it's just remarkable to me, and I still find every day since I've come out, I find out something new about what people were doing for me while I was inside. But I knew some of that, while I was inside, so that was really incredibly helpful. Uh, Equally, or even more important, I suppose, mate, again, something I've alluded to earlier, the incredible support of Burmese people inside were just inspirational. And I would look at them, be inspired by them, as well as helped in all sorts of practical ways. So, that kept me going as well. Then some other things, mate. I'm a real bookworm, always have been. Books have been my entire life. The reason I exist is to read, basically. And so once I was able to get books, but mind you, that was only after about 3 months in. Then I could just read and read and read and read, and the books inspired me. Thinking about them inspired me. Yeah, so that's a very large part of the story as well, of psychological survival. Having books, reading them, but then also just thinking about them, memorizing them, things like that. Because I think that the psychological aspect, to me, is probably more important than the physical side. Up to a point, of course, as long as you've got, actual enough sustenance and so on, which of course some people have not had. But once that's out of the way, I think the psychological issues are probably more difficult to deal with day to day. So yeah, so if you've got some way of coping with that, then I think you can get through it. I think the hardest part, mate, was definitely those first few months when I was just locked in solitary in this box, as I call it, in a police station that was just outside the walls of insane prison. So I was totally alone with absolutely nothing, nothing to read, nothing to uh, keep my mind anywhere but being in that cell. So I had to really reach deep into my own psychological resources on that. Which and this has probably not been helpful for much of the rest of my life, but here it came to the fore in that I have a very rich imagination that I'm able to reach into and come up with stories and as usual silly stuff, imagine different endings to sporting events or I don't know, even like political terms of office and coming up with, as I say, all sorts of narratives that I can just run with and keep my mind occupied. So yeah, so I think in those periods, mate, without anything at all, that was the most difficult times. But yeah, where you're just sort of thrown on resources that you may or may not have, depending on who you are and so on. And I think in this case I was lucky, but yeah, but touch and go, to be honest, because even though I was able to use that, it didn't take much to send you off into a spiral, and which you'd then try to recover from. But yeah, so I think those times of complete isolation, and also I suppose in that early period as well, because at that point I hadn't even been charged. There was no real direction where things were going. It became apparent after a while that I was just going to be there for a long time, but there didn't seem to be any signpost I could look for when it would end. So I think yeah, those first couple of months were the worst. I think, mate. Oh, well, I suppose, mate, just message to people outside of just how admirable these people are. The courage of them is incredible. The whole time I was there, so nearly 2 years, I never saw a single instance, not one, of anyone sort of cracking under the pressure of it all. The incredible solidarity and goodwill I saw. I mean, occasionally little tensions would arise, but not much. I was just gobsmacked at the way that people looked out for each other, in all sorts of ways. Again, practical, but socially, psychologically, spiritually, and all of that. So yeah, just utterly inspiring. They were and are. And as I mentioned earlier, their situation much worse than mine because I mentioned the worst times for me was when I thought things were not going in any particular direction and there didn't seem to be an end point. But of course, they have to live that all the time. I knew that I had an entire government, an entire country behind me, as well as many other countries, and they don't have that at all. Their only support is their families outside, and those families are consistently being harassed and all that by the regime outside. Many of them are poor and so on as well. So I'm just lost in admiration for them, mate. And yeah, these people are so admirable, and I think I just took real positive message out of their energy, out of their courage, and it gives me hope if I think about it now, just in terms of these people will feature in the country's rebuilding, just as all the people resisting the regime more broadly are, and that gives me confidence because these are just top quality people, if I can put it that way. Good question, eh? So my initial focus was to write that unlikely prisoner, but both as sort of a little bit of a catharsis to me, to tell the story. And above all, I think, Julian, to tell the story, and this is the hint to the title, of course, to tell a story that would resonate with people outside Myanmar. Because unfortunately, in countries like Australia, Europe, America, and so on, people don't know very much about Myanmar. They often have trouble identifying with it. It seems a place a long way away, and all the rest of it. But I think because my story was again, as per the title, just so unlikely, I think people could sort of identify with that because for people who know me will know that I'm barely over 5 foot. I was 57 years old when I was arrested. I was an academic. I was about the most sort of harmless person you could imagine. And I think the idea that I would be locked up by this regime and put in this prison and all that, I think just sent an incredible message to people around the world that as to the nature of this regime, So, yeah, so the first thing, mate, was to, write that book, get the story across, pay tribute to my fellow prisoners and the Burmese people more broadly, but also, to get the message across of the horror of what was going on in Myanmar and the extraordinary corners that it could reach if it could get someone like me. So, so above all, wanted to do that. Then I think, secondly, look at the economics and try to, continue the usual thing of trying to work out what's going on, trying to document the descent of the country and to critique that and even though I think the regime's mishandling of the economy has been so bad that there is no narrative that really needs to be pushed on, because I suppose I was a little bit worried when I first got out. I thought, gee, is this regime getting the applause for managing the economy or something, and the Mussolini thing, they're not very nice, but they're making the trains run on time. Well, of course they're not. It's a complete catastrophe. And I don't think I've ever seen a single serious suggestion that that anything they're doing is good for the economy. So I guess that part of an objective hasn't loomed large because this regime just condemns themselves daily, sort of thing, by their mismanagement. But I was initially concerned to do that. As I mentioned with this latest book, mate, I wanted to get across what the story of economic reform was under the NLD government. I didn't want that story to disappear to history. So wanted to do that. And other than that, Julian, to be honest, I just want to assist my friends in Myanmar. That's really it now. Just to keep plugging away in whatever capacity I can. The struggle is theirs, and they're the ones who will win it. But anything I can do is sort of what I want to do, and so for the foreseeable future, I think that's what I'll be trying to do. Well, it's dark at the moment, and I think more horrors are to come. But to me, there is light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that this regime is doomed, I think, Julian, and it's only a matter of time. But I don't want to sound too sanguine or too naive about that because I do know that they will cling on to the end. And as I say, they will visit more horror upon the country in their departure. So yeah, so I'm not at all, blasé about what's ahead. But to me, the end point is clear that they will fail. I think everything points to it. I'm not a military expert at all, so I wouldn't venture an opinion on that. But people who I've come to respect who do commentate on that would suggest that the military story is all going one way. But what I can talk about is the economy and the finances and all that, and that backs up the military story. That this is a regime that's absolutely desperate. And as we were talking earlier, that all of economic policy is just bent to survival now. And they're doing the sort of things that regimes do when they're in their death spiral. Again, it's all short term. Medium term, a lot of their stuff is destructive. By every announcement, they make the place a place where no one will invest. And yet they'll do that because they want whatever it is that they're stealing, they're expropriating, they need it and they want it now. So if I look at that, everything is pointing in the direction of regime to collapse. There are horrors to come, but after that, I'm again. I don't want to, I don't want to come across as being too naive or too optimistic, too sunny side up, and all the rest of it. But just looking at the courage that I saw in the prison, the courage, incredible nous that the young people have, in particular outside Myanmar, coming up with all sorts of plans for the economy and other things post regime. I'm quite confident that that things will be different this time. And I would back that up too, just even in comparison to what had happened before, back before the NLD period of government. If I look around and see the international situation now, the things that the Burmese diaspora are doing, the things that the young people are doing to oppose this regime, it just gives me immense confidence. It just they just seem to be different. And so I'm hopeful, come regime collapse, that the ultimate outcome will be much different as well. I don't think so, mate. Except I suppose to just to urge the extent that anyone would listen to me, for the rest of the international community to pay attention to Myanmar. I think it's terribly worrying for us all who care about the country and its people, the way that Myanmar and its issues have just fallen down the league table of international interest. That's the horrors in Myanmar are there just daily, and yet it'll seldom be reported. But I'd like to think that the international community might pay a little bit more attention to the place, because I think with just a little bit of support, the opposition to Myanmar's military regime would bring about their end quite quickly.